Okay. Yeah, so the recording has started.
Okay,
Th-
cool.
Cool. Does it show that? Okay. So I guess to start things off, this is Alex Lamb. I'm a grad student at the University of Montreal. I'm interviewing Martin Arjovsky. He's from Argentina. He was a visiting student at the University of Montreal, where he developed the unitary RNN. And he's now a PhD student in computer science at NYU. And he's pretty well known for the Wasserstein GAN idea. Is there anything you would want to add to that? Oh, you also do stuff with Facebook research, right?
Yeah, I'm interning right now in there. Yeah, I still have to figure out exactly what we're gonna do, but it should be fun.
With Jan Olivier, right?
Yeah, Jan Olivier and Leon Botou and probably David Lopez Paz as well.
Are you in France?
I'm in France, yeah, I'm in Paris.
Okay. Oh, Leon Batou went to France then?
Well, no, Leon is in New York, but he's gonna come here at some moment.
Okay. All right.
But
Yeah.
it's good. I mean, there's this thing called the internet, so we can work together even if he's in New York. Yeah.
Right.
It's
All
really
right. Yeah. Okay. So my the first question I wrote down is, can you briefly explain the generative adversarial network, or GAN?
Sure. Yeah. So in GANs, the goal is to learn a data distribution, meaning and to be able to generate samples that look like the original data distribution. So what this means is that you have a bunch of data points that are typically high-dimensional vectors, and you want to generate a new point that looks like the other ones. So for example, if your data set had exactly one more point, what would that point look like? Meaning it probably won't look exactly as one of the other ones. It will look something different, but with similar distribution. And yeah, you can phrase this problem as essentially trying to create one distribution that's parameterized by your generator, which grabs a noise vector and then creates samples from it by passing it through a neural network. And you have to figure out how to train this. And the beautiful idea that Ian Goodfellow and other people from Montreal derived was that you can have a discriminator, which is another network that tries to differentiate your generated samples from your real samples. And yeah, the idea is that the generator fools the discriminator, and the discriminator tries to differentiate between fake and real. And in the end, it makes sense that if you can fool a very good discriminator, such as a neural net, if a neural net cannot tell your images from real or from the real ones, then it means that they are pretty good. They look like the real, at least. What
was your first encounter with the GAN idea, and what was your sort of initial impression of the idea?
So that's a good question. I started hearing about GANs roughly when I was in Montreal. I was in Montreal in a very interesting time. I was there from September, I think, to December 2015 in the beginning, and that was long after the GAN idea was already on archive and LabGAN had already came out. But no one really, so far, I think VAEs were working still better and they were easier to train than GANs. And most people in the lab that were doing generative modeling were doing VAE type of things. But still, people liked the GAN idea and that it was kind of, I don't know, interesting to have these things, but I didn't really know what it was about. I started reading the paper because my friend Amar Shah was working on VAE things, and I was interested in learning a lot of things when I was there. I didn't really understand the paper when I read it, but to be honest, I wasn't that well versed in deep learning back then. And after, in the meantime, roughly, I think in October, by the ICLR deadline, Sumit Chintala, well, Alec Radford, Luke Metz, and Sumit Chintala's DCGAN paper came by, and these amazing pictures, generated pictures of bedrooms that we saw, and faces and everything, and people were like, holy shit, this is incredible. So then I started actually trying to dive into it, and I kind of understood roughly the idea. And yeah, by then, everyone, like after a week of that paper, everyone in Montreal was discussing this paper. So, I mean, a lot of interesting discussion came by.
I see.
Yeah.
Did you initially have the feeling that there was something conceptually interesting there, or that the theory could be interesting? Or is that something that took you some time?
No, it definitely took some time. To be honest, I wasn't really doing generative modeling back then, and I didn't really understand the paper very well. To be honest, I didn't really understand VAEs well back then. And I don't know, I was just thinking about like RNNs and other things. But right after I left Montreal, and at that point I started getting interested into it because it was quite like the results were quite impressive. And after some time, I went to, right after I left Montreal, I went to Facebook for an internship working on StarCraft, completely unrelated. But Sumit Chintala was my manager then, and Leon Botus, who's now my advisor, sat like 2 feet away from me, and people were discussing GANs, and Leon actually told me, look, there's like a lot of interesting shit going on in here. And that's when I was like, oh, this is quite cool. And that's when I started like coming up with ideas and trying to understand what was going on. But still on a very like theoretical level, I wasn't like playing around with GANs or anything like that. I was still trying to make StarCraft work. Then I realized it wasn't going to work, at least because I was too dumb to take on the project by myself. And even, yeah, there was a lot of stuff that we were trying to do, and I was trying to do that I didn't really know how to do. But yeah, after that, I started doing GANs, which was quite an interesting thing.
What would you say is the significance of the GAN idea, sort of with respect to the machine learning research community as a whole?
I think it's incredibly hard to say. By itself, I think GANs are just like one of the best ideas and one of the most important contributions in the, like I completely agree with Jan in the sense that it's probably the most important contribution in machine learning in the last 10 years.
In fact, I've thought that like if you were going to give someone who had never heard anything about neural nets a quick synopsis of it, like kind of a quick explanation of it is, with neural nets, like you define this forward process or computation graph, and you define a loss, and then you do gradient descent to minimize that loss. And the loss typically would make your output closer to your target for a given input. And then the adversarial setup gives you a way to adapt that to the setting where, rather than having a single output for a given input, you can have a set of different outputs, or a distribution over different outputs for a given input.
Yeah, the picture I usually give when I talk about this with people that don't have any clue about neural nets is that, yeah, you basically have like, I mean, it's the same story that everyone's been telling, but you have a discriminate, you have the role of the police in some way. Like, you imagine I give you 100 paintings of Picasso and you're trying to create a new painting of Picasso, not just out an old painting of Picasso, but really create a new one in the style of Picasso. And the idea is that you have a forger that's telling you, oh no, this is fake because of this, this, and this, and you come up with a new painting that doesn't have all of those flaws, and thus you learn to generate new paintings of Picasso. If I was telling to a mathematician what this would look like, it's basically you have this you would like to calculate. It's not clear how this loss function behaves very well, but it makes sense, at least in an intuitive level, to optimize this loss function. And the problem is that loss function is impossible to calculate, but you can approximate it with another neural network. So it's like having one neural network to estimate the loss for another one.
If GANs hadn't been developed by Ian Goodfellow and others in the Bengio group at Montreal, how long do you think it would have taken for the GAN idea to develop elsewhere?
Well, that's an excellent question, and the honest answer by me is that I don't know. At the moment, I thought it was such a unique idea that it wouldn't really have come up unless that paper came by. On the other hand, it's very hard to say. for example, Schmidt-Huber had this paper, I think in 94 or something like that, that had a very similar idea. Of course, in 94 there were no GPUs, there was no Theano, there was, I don't know.
I forgot the name of the Schmidt-Huber thing. I think it's, is it like predictability minimization, something like that?
So I haven't read the paper, but I'm just recopilating some of the things that I've heard. And so I've heard like similar in spirit, that it's a similar idea in spirit. And I also heard that, well, long before generative adversarial networks came by, there was this thing called maximum mean discrepancy, which is another loss function between distributions. That's a similar problem. It's a minimax procedure, only the maximum, instead of being the discriminator, is given by a kernel. So of course it doesn't work as well because neural networks work much better. But it had this and it's along the time where Ian Goodfellow, maybe Ian Goodfellow came by a year before, some of these people from Skolkoff's lab in Tübingen who developed MMD were actually switching to neural networks for a lot of their problems. So it's hard to say. I knew some of them were thinking of similar ideas back then as well.
That's interesting.
But I don't know necessarily how much time it would have come up. And it's interesting. I definitely think Ian Goodfellow made something huge, simply because even after the paper came in, it took a long time for people to actually like keep working on it and the thing to actually work to the level of DC GANs, for example.
When I've talked to Aaron Corville about it, he said that when the GAN paper was submitted and stuff, he thought that it would just be like a cute idea and kind of an academic curiosity, and no one would want to use it because it's just like so unstable and practical. And in fact, I remember when I was working at Amazon, I tried like reading and re-implementing the GAN paper like reasonably soon after it came out. And I remember just getting it to fit like two one-dimensional Gaussians to each other was not that easy.
So it's even if like similar people had similar ideas, it's not clear that they would have put it to completion. There's a lot of that we don't know, especially since this is such a thing that it's very hard to evaluate. So imagine you try something similar, it doesn't work, and you're like, oh, this makes no sense, and you drop it, simply because also there's no numbers involved. So I think a lot of unique combinations of factors came in, like Ian had this brilliant idea. He was in a group where neural networks were something that people were doing. So basically he had Theano, he had a lot of experience in neural networks, he knew how to manage these things. So a lot of things came by at the same time that made Ian Goodfellow possible, at least in my opinion, to publish this amazing paper. It's hard to say that those kind of similar things would have happened in the same moment in a short time after that, regardless of whether this paper had came out. I don't know.
Yeah. When you started thinking about the GAN idea, do you feel like you kind of thought about it pretty deeply and then you kind of implemented it and started coding, or did you implement it before you thought about it much?
No, actually, the first GAN I actually implemented, I mean, I did, okay, so first I developed a couple of ideas that didn't really pan out because they were too complicated and I had the wrong intuition as well. So the simple thing that Leon and I were thinking of was that, oh, look, we are trying to estimate this loss better, let's just train the discriminator to optimality, it's gonna work better. And we were chatting with Sumit, who like implemented some of these things. And it was like a lot of things we didn't have to implement it back then, simply because Sumit had tried a lot of things and he knew exactly how each experiment would go by. So it was a very quick round trip time in some way, which was nice. But actually the first GAN I properly implemented was, I think, 2 weeks before the iClear deadline this year when I was...
It was the principal methods paper?
Yeah, roughly, I think, no, not 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks or something like that, when I was like finalizing the experiment. I knew how each experiment was gonna go by because I had thought with Sumit, and like we had the right intuition, I think. But yeah, that's the first moment I actually like coded things up and thought the GAN.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's usually not how things go for me, but that is cool.
Yeah, but we had most of the ideas before we got it. But again, I was lucky that Sumit knew how every single experiment was gonna show up as well.
Right. So I guess shifting gears a little bit. Throughout a lot of your papers, you've been critical of the maximum likelihood objective.
Yeah.
Machine learning. Was this like direction of criticism something that came to you after you started learning about GANs, or was it something that you had been thinking about earlier?
So to be fair, I started learning about unsupervised learning and generative modeling at the same time as I started learning about GANs. So both things came roughly at the same time. I remember that the moment where I started to dislike likelihood quite a bit was when, so if you look at the introduction of principled towards principled methods for the first, it's kind of like in the intro in a very informal way, it details the fact that the KL is something very asymmetric, and when you assign 0 probability to a data point, then log likelihood just puts your cost to infinity, and when you use the reverse KL, so basically log likelihood and the usual KL pay a huge cost of mode dropping, and when you switch the KLs, the opposite happens, where it basically pays a lot of cost for generating fake-looking samples.
Hold on. So to give a little bit of context, I guess when machine learning people talk about maximum likelihood, what they mean is you have samples from a data distribution, P, and you generally don't know like the density that corresponds to that distribution P. And then you have an estimator distribution Q. And the way that you try to pull Q and P closer together is you maximize the expected value where your expectation is over X's sampled from P of X of log of Q of X.
So you maximize the probability of your Q distribution at your data points. So you grab your model that assigns the highest probability to the data points. But the way that's phrased in the maximum likelihood principle is that
I'm just pointing out that you use that interchangeably with you'd call that the KL from P to Q. And
so
when you talk about reverse KL, you're talking about the KL from Q to P.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason why a lot of people use maximum likelihood is, or KL from P to Q, is that you can sample from P and you usually can compute the PDF of Q because it's your estimating distribution.
Yeah. So, or at least you can put a bound on that and optimize that bound.
Yeah.
So So the thing that drove me away from maximum likelihood was then when I saw that integral and I saw, oh look, like the usual KL assigns a lot of cost for mode dropping, and the bad KL, the reverse KL assigns cost for generating fake-looking samples. Not the bad KL, probably the good one for most things. But yeah.
So it has the thing. It has the thing where if Q doesn't, I guess, match the support of P, or if Q has a smaller support than P, then the KL is infinite.
Yeah.
Which, it seems pretty counterintuitive.
And all of these things we started realizing when I was in Facebook, and mostly with discussions with Leon, it was quite interesting. And at the same moment as I was learning generative modeling, this paper by Lucas Thies was submitted to iClear, which was basically the experimental side of a lot of these ideas, and that had like pretty interesting consequences and a pretty interesting observation about how these things behave in practice, which correlated with the intuition that we were developing.
Right. Although one thing I'll say about that is there have been these auto-regressive models trained by maximum likelihood, like Pixel CNN, WaveNet, or I guess also these RNNs, or what people typically think of as a generative RNN for language modeling.
Yeah.
And those are trained on a maximum likelihood objective. And at least in some cases, sample quality is reasonably high.
Okay, so I will give I will tell you my opinion on this.
Okay.
It's my very biased opinion because I like GANs, but so usually all of these losses, when you consider the KL, the reverse KL, all of these things, when you are able to optimize them, all of them are consistent. Meaning, if you have enough data and you have enough capacity, your models will capture the true distribution. And Pixel RNN, Pixel CNN, etc., for the data sets, they're typically evaluated, which are either 32 by 32 or 64 by 64 images. And they're pretty good models, especially for 64 by 64 images. It makes sense that they are able to capture the data distribution. But the type of problems we're interested in a lot of times is when we have either small models or just incredibly complex problems, such as the ones that we suspect arise in artificial intelligence. Like when we simply don't have enough data or enough compute time or enough just crazy models to.
So that's interesting. So the angle or your interpretation of it is that these models are actually using their capacity very badly, but because they're being run on relatively simple data sets, and they have a lot of capacity, it still turns out okay.
It's not that they use it badly. They use it, so you have two things roughly, which is the diversity in one end, and this is very rough, of course, but you have like diversity and you have sample quality. And log likelihood models are very much focused on diversity, but they still have a reward for achieving sample quality. So if you have a large enough model on a simple enough problem, and in this case, it's more about having large models on like small images, you are able to capture both. But that's why I think you also never saw things like Pixel CNN or Pixel RNN samples on 256 by 256 or like really hard problems where GANs have actually been trained. The only examples I know of like high resolution images. So the only, well, I mean, you have stacked GAN, you have WGAN, you have things like this that actually like have really good results in high resolution images. They are somewhat supervised, they have hierarchical architectures, they are impossible to train except by the people that made the paper and a few other. But the GANs have shown in some very hard tasks. While I haven't seen results from Pixel RNN, Pixel CNN on like really hard, on the equivalent level of hardness such as GANs. The only problems where I saw high resolution images coming from Pixel CNN or Pixel RNN was with an extreme amount of conditioning. For example, conditioning the output image on the entire segmentation of the image. So basically for every single pixel in the image, you assign the label, or you condition on the caption of the image or on these things, which makes the problem much simpler. Anyway, that's my viewpoint, but again, this is more or less intuition that it is because we don't have still, I mean, it's very hard to say prove negative results conclusively. Like,
yeah, it's true. Although at the same time, they don't have like the blurring effects that people would see with like variational autoencoders if you go back to that stuff. And I remember for a while, like around Mila, like a lot of people would blame like the blurring type stuff in samples on training with maximum likelihood.
I don't think necessarily the blurring is a problem of maximum likelihood. I think the blurring might be a problem also on the noise model that VAEs have. Even VAEs with very complicated posteriors still typically have like conditional Gaussians as noise models, which are terrible for images. Like they don't capture any Fourier moments, any wavelet coefficients, anything like this, which are like super important for things like textures, all of these things. Like the noise model completely will kill that. So unless you have the specific capacity to make your noise model very tiny, like you're just
like it remembers everything important in Z.
Yeah, I mean, unless you like have like almost a perfect encoder-decoder thing, your noise model will have to be like very non-trivial, as we see in every single paper, by the way, because this is something that we talk about on the WGAN paper a bit. But essentially, as long as the noise model is non-trivial, you're going to have blurry samples, simply by the fact that you are just putting a big chunk of noise that doesn't correlate with the type of Fourier noise that we see in images, for example.
Yeah. So I guess I'm gonna move a little bit to your research.
Sure.
So what was the key idea of the principled methods for training GANs paper that I guess you had at iClear?
Yeah.
I guess what made you start thinking about that?
So yeah, what made us start thinking about that was, well, it was like a combination of two things, roughly. We were talking about with Leon that Leon was very convinced that if we train more the discriminator, things are going to get better.
Yeah.
And that made sense because, look, we are going to estimate our loss better if we train our discriminator better. And Sumit instantly told us, no, you're going to get bad samples. And your discriminator, and something that Sumit also told us was, the discriminator starts capturing very precise noise that's in your generator's data, that's not in your training data, and it will have accuracy one. And that was very interesting to me because if you have two distributions that have any overlapping support, there won't be any, this behavior won't happen because points that are in both support, when they're sampled from one distribution and from the other one, the discriminator is always going to make a mistake. If it always says the discriminator is a deterministic function, it's either for a point, it's either always going to say fake or always going to say real. And if that point has positive probability from coming from either fake or real, then the discriminator should make mistakes. And we didn't see that in practice. Like the discriminator set gets one test accuracy. It's not overfitting, it gets one test accuracy. If you train for long enough. And long enough is like 50 millibatches. It's not even that long.
Wait, but I don't know. I mean, if you have like just like two Gaussians and they're overlapping with each other, I mean, I guess the discriminator is going to make mistakes where they're overlapping, but
yeah, but if the Gaussians are very far away, like that overlapping is really non-existent. Like, I mean, I guess non-existent is, in this case, like probability of that happening is less than 10 to the minus 20 or something like that. Like,
right.
Because as you move the means apart, the probability gets like b exponentially. So, when I mean like the discriminator doesn't make any mistake, it's that it gets one accuracy on the test data, basically. Yeah. That doesn't mean that in theory it doesn't, but like it tells you that the probability is very tiny, probably exponentially tiny.
Yeah. So can you explain the idea of the Wasserstein GAN? The intuition, what problem it's trying. Well, just.
So the intuition is that if you have two distributions that have disjoint support, all of like KL, Jensen Shannon, etc., are going to they're not going to give you any meaningful gradient. So we were like, okay, what other distances between distributions give you a reasonable gradient? And the Wasserstein distance is a very nice distance in the sense that it picks, well, it has a very beautiful theory, but aside from that, it has the nice property that it pulls your fake points to the real points. It's not trying to look at probabilities, it's just trying to move points to other points. So even if the supports are disjoint, it looks at the distance between the supports and you'll get a gradient because the gradient is roughly going to be proportional to that distance, like the cost you're going to get, sorry. So even if the things are pulled apart, you still get a gradient from how much pulled apart it is.
So hold on a second. So maximum likelihood KL from P to Q, if the distributions they're disjoint, I can see why the KL would be infinite there. And in the reverse KL, I can also see why it would be infinite. But why would it be infinite for the Jensen-Shannon divergence?
So for the Jensen-Shannon, it wouldn't be infinite, but it would be constantly log 2. Like basically, even if you have the two supports this is your fake support and this is your real support, it would be log 2 regardless of your support being here or here. So the gradient of the JSD would be 0 anyway.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's not infinite. It's just constantly. It's just constantly log 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
So while you were sort of thinking about and writing the WGAN paper,
Yeah.
were you ever worried that there would be some kind of simple trick that would sort of preempt the motivation for the work? Or were you sort of confident that that either something like that wouldn't happen, or if it did happen, things would be okay?
Well, I have a very biased viewpoint because obviously the things I do research on because I think they're the correct solution. But it's hard to say. I thought we were onto something because like a lot of the things we said were very well verified by evidence, in the sense that it's very rough what you can get by training. When you have an imperfect discriminator, it's very hard. The feedback you can get is very bad a lot of times, and you see that in practice. And also, like, the things that we said, for my understanding of the issues, made a lot of sense. And I didn't think, I think a lot of fundamental issues were appearing that needed something like this to be solved. However, I was thinking something similar when we proposed the noise trick for towards principled methods, and there were some things that we weren't very clear on in our heads, in the sense that the noise is very hard to tune. So, like, it wasn't in the end a perfect solution that we were thinking of. I mean, of course, we didn't claim that it was a perfect solution in the paper because we didn't have evidence for that yet. But I mean, I thought back then that it was like that might solve it. But after more studying, we realized, oh, this is not the end of the story, and then WGAN came in. And a lot of times you think that what you're coming up with is the end of the story, but there are, of course, things that you understand. So it was very hard to say. Like, at no point I did believe that we were on something big, but at no point I was convinced that this was the only solution, or that something simpler might not do the trick. But I was encouraged by the fact that a lot of people were trying a lot of different tricks on GANs, and none of them seemed to work very well. So that was quite encouraging.
Well, the least squares GAN seems to work reasonably well, but
it seems to work reasonably well.
Although maybe it all depends on how hard you push it. But
yeah.
I don't know, like, if you do like this simple like 1D Gaussian thing, and you make like the true Gaussian that your data distribution, you make it this really narrow, spiky Gaussian.
Yeah.
If you do like just a normal GAN, like it doesn't work at all. But if you do your Wasserstein GAN, it works reasonably well without too much tuning, and the least squares GAN does as well. But of course, the Wasserstein GAN has interesting theory.
No, of course. I mean, like, there's a lot of things that we don't know that happen when you're estimating a loss in an imperfect way with a neural network.
Yeah.
So there's of course things that we are not seeing. But I think, I mean, I haven't seen enough evidence to be convinced that least square GANs work like really well on very hard tasks. Most of the papers I've seen applying least squares GAN had a lot of the usual GAN tricks as well. So it's very hard to say. But again, I mean, I have seen papers using them that report quite a good success. So there's probably something in there.
Yeah.
I definitely don't think the story is over with least square GANs nor anything like that, simply because I haven't seen massively good results. I mean, I haven't seen, for example, state-of-the-art on inception, even though inception has a lot of flaws, is that it does correlate quite well with sample quality. And I haven't seen like really remarkable results on inception scores, for example, with least square GANs. I don't know, little things like that. But I don't know. I haven't implemented it myself. It's very hard to say exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, well, for example, I don't know, I've like talked to Ashan about some of the stuff he's doing, and he says when you move to like deeper or more complicated architectures with like least squares GAN and I think also to some extent with like the WGAN and the improved WGAN, it's still hard to get like stability.
No, I definitely believe that. And even if you look at simpler non-adversarial things like deep deterministic policy gradient, for example, where you still have this issue of one network estimating the loss for the other one in a continuous setting. Like all the critics, which would be like the discriminator, were very, very narrow because bad things happen that we now understand a bit better when the critic gets very deep. Basically, you can estimate your Q function very well, but the gradient goes in the wrong direction. And things like that might be happening, for example, as well when you have very deep GANs that are far beyond the fact of which loss function you choose, that have to do with the fact that you are approximating a loss function with a neural network.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things might be present in WGAN as well. We don't know. But I have seen that WGANs, at least this is from what I get from Ishan, trying a bunch of stuff, that WGANs really work quite well when you like put very deep and complicated networks on it. And the same doesn't happen with other methods, as far as I've seen at least.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about who Wasserstein was and why he created the Wasserstein distance?
So that apparently it's like I only know from Villani's paper like an epsilon of the story, and I know the part that I remember from Villani's book, which is obviously not the whole story. So Wasserstein, while he formalized the distance and said, "Oh, look, this distance have this shape," really the creator of all that line of research was Kantorovich, who was the one that first said the Earth mover distance is this is the Kantorovich duality. Yeah. Like even like Villani says, like really if something should be named after someone, all these books should be named after Kantorovich. And Kantorovich was interested really in like optimal transport problems, like from a financial point of view. I think he was a Nobel Prize on economics as well. If I'm not mistaken, I think he created linear programming also. And the reason of why, yeah. I may be wrong, but I think I'm like 90% sure on that, maybe 80. But anyhow, yeah. And the reason why he was interested in moving stuff from one place to the other place in the cheapest possible way. That's why he created like optimal transport theory, basically.
Yeah.
And how like Wasserstein essentially tells you that the distance between two piles of things, or in our case, two probability distributions, is the cheapest. That distance is the cheapest way of moving all your probability mass from one place to another.
So one thing that's interesting is with this Wasserstein metric, or this Wasserstein distance between two distributions.
Yeah.
It kind of depends on, I guess, like a metric for like how far like mass has moved between two different points, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas if you think about something like the KL divergence, it's kind of agnostic to the metric of the space. And there's a way in which that's a big advantage in that it lets you think about how different your two distributions are if the support doesn't overlap.
Yeah.
But do you think there's also disadvantages to that? That you have to define this metric?
Yes. So there's advantages, of course, in the sense that involving this metric lets you think about what happens on disjoint supports, and it lets you think about things it leverages the geometry and the distance between points that's underlying in the data, while the KL ignores it.
And for the Wasserstein GAN, is it an L1?
It's for the improved Wasserstein GAN, it's an L2 on the pixels, which is bad. So again, something you can do is probably, so the Kramer GAN paper came by where they use the energy distance is a terrible distance when you use it on pixel space, where the Wasserstein is not. Wasserstein has many issues. But the beautiful thing that the Kramer GAN paper does is, okay, we have this distance, which is bad on pixel space, but it has all these nice properties. So let's do this on feature space. And it has the nicer property that the energy distance has is that it has unbiased gradients, and among other things, it's very easy to compute in closed form, which was so they create a feature space adversarially, and they use the energy distance in there. So you could do the same thing. It will be tricky because it would involve a third network in the case of WGAN, but if you do it smartly, maybe you can avoid it in the sense that you can do Wasserstein in feature space. You can now. The problem is that okay. So let me pull it back a bit. Using the L2 distance in pixel space is probably bad because it's not a natural way to measure similarity between images. Yeah. However, this gives you the freedom to create new distances, or for example, create embeddings that are very powerful that we know how to do a lot of times in machine learning, and leverage those embeddings by applying the distance in that space. Yeah.
So I haven't read the Kramer GAN paper.
You should. It's a good paper.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, there are a lot of GAN stability papers coming out, but this is probably one that's worth reading. So, is it right to think of it as like you have some hidden space on top of, say, like your image or your input, and you're doing Wasserstein distance where the metric is in that hidden space? Is that right?
So that's not the Kramer GAN, but that's something very similar to that. The Kramer GAN applying this thing called the energy distance, which is very similar to Wasserstein in a lot of ways. It's not, if you could compute it, both of them, and you had infinite data, Wasserstein would be a much better distance. But the Kramer, the energy distance has a lot of nice properties that Wasserstein doesn't have. Doing them on pixel space, and in a lot of other spaces, Wasserstein behaves incredibly well, and energy distance behaves incredibly bad. So what they do is, in feature space, they use the energy distance, which behaves pretty well. Yeah, and that's about it. It's not using the Wasserstein distance in feature space, it's using the energy distance in feature space.
So one interesting thing that I recently learned is that Wasserstein is still alive.
Yeah.
Whenever you hear about like a metric or a divergence, and for some reason, if the name is Russian, I just assume that the person died in the 70s or something. But he's actually a professor at, I think, Penn State now.
Penn State? I thought he was still in Russia, really.
I think so. Well, anyway, what do you think he thinks of the WGAN work, the Wasserstein GAN work, if he's aware of it?
I don't know. That's a good question. We should ask him. We should send him an email. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think he'd be interested to see things applied in machine learning, but I don't know how much he cares about generating bedrooms as much as we do, to be honest. And even if he's interested in that, maybe it's not like appealing to him theoretically or anything like that. I honestly don't know. But it'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah. So what do you think is the overall reception that the WGAN has had in the community? You know, it's actually funny. I wrote down that question probably a few months ago.
Yeah.
Actually, now the WGAN has a lot of citations. At least it has a lot, but also relative to how new the paper is. So the reception has been pretty positive.
Yeah.
Was there anything surprising to you, or was there anything that came out of it that maybe you didn't expect?
I don't know. It got really big, which is interesting. I mean, some people, I wasn't expecting that, you know, the machine learning community, and I guess this happens in research as well, like it's very adversarial in some ways. Like when someone comes up with a method, it's like, oh, this method performs better than this and performs worse than this. So even when, yeah, I don't know. It's been interesting to see how when a paper gets big, people like comment on your work in certain ways, Like there's a lot, when you publish a paper that gets a lot of response, there's a lot more scrutiny going on, which is interesting. And I don't know, I'm getting used to that. I think it's okay. But no, like I'm glad that people like the paper, to be honest. That's good. And I'm glad, more than that, I'm glad that people are finding it useful and that it's getting a lot of follow-up in applications and things like that, which is nice. And a lot of people in the theory community are also liking it quite a bit because it paints a clearer picture of what's going on. I'm pretty happy about it, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. what do you think are the most exciting open problems related to GANs and generative models in general?
Well, I don't know in generative models. I'd like to see exactly what happens, because Ishan has pointed out that things get weirder as you get with deeper, like very nonlinear and very complicated critiques, and and the same happens in every GAN, and the same thing happens in deep deterministic policy gradients. So it'd be interesting to see if there's a simple solution to that, of what's the fundamental problem going on in there when you have a very complicated function estimating the loss for another function. That's something that could be interesting. And something that I'm really interested right now is that, okay, what is this useful for? In the sense that, there's this beautiful paper that came out from Berkeley about intrinsically reinforcement learning by self-supervision. The application I always have in mind is, when I'm doing GANs or generative modeling, is using them for either planning or like forward modeling for intrinsic rewards or intrinsic motivation. And this paper basically does it very well, but in feature space, and it just uses a deterministic map. It's not even a stochastic thing like a conditional GAN. And because of the representation, how it's learning the novelty of that work is really in picking the representation of the states by doing inverse action prediction and using a simple forward model to predict the representation, which normally I would have thought, or some other people would have thought, that a GAN would be ideal for that. But it turns out that for a lot of problems, doing something simple when you do it in the right space matters a lot more than having a very complicated model. So coming back to the discussion, I'd be very interested if predicting pixels is useful from an AI point of view. I know it's useful from maybe rendering, maybe people that want to do art, things like this. I'm really happy about. But I'd like to see if it's useful from an AI point of view, or should we just have simpler predictive models in a better space?
So it's interesting. If you just mentally try to think of, say, another person who you know, saying something, just try to get that audio signal in your head, you can get something that maybe it's definitely something different from an actual hallucination of the person saying.
For sure.
But maybe it reflects the experience of actually hearing the person say it, or maybe it's different. It's hard to be, I guess, introspective about this sort of thing. But I guess it's possible that the brain does learn generative models, but it's already in a significantly more abstract space than the pixel space.
And maybe we need focus on that. Of course, it's basically the end goal of deep learning anyway, to learn better representations, and what does that mean, etc., etc. That's obviously still an important problem. But maybe we should be paying more attention on that and learning principled ways of learning representations that are useful to get I don't know, the different things that we care from an AI point of view, than predicting perfectly at pixel level the outputs. Instead, we could have simpler models, maybe in a better representation, which would make sense. I don't know.
That's it's an interesting point. What do you think about connections between reinforcement learning and GANs?
So that's what I was talking about roughly. As I said, I was thinking that GANs would be ideal for doing things like planning or doing. And planning is interesting because you also need a diversity component. You, more than everything, you care that the plans you're making in your head are actually make sense and are not just random garbage, but you care about making different plans, especially if you're doing something like Monte Carlo tree search.
You're saying you want to have you want to explore different possibilities for how things could unfold in the future, so that when you estimate your value function, you can have more good choices to pick from.
Or even if you have already a value function, you could do planning on top with some of these models. That's something I would be really interested. And that and intrinsically motivated reinforcement learning, model-based intrinsically motivated RL are two things I'm really interested in. At this moment, I'm not doing any RL research because it takes a lot of dealing with the environment, and at least for me, which is a very bad coder, the learning to doing ratio is very little. But it's something that I definitely have on the back of my head a lot of time. I try to keep up with the papers.
One thing that could be interesting that I think, to my knowledge, hasn't been explored too much is doing unsupervised learning, where you're able to interact with an environment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like you don't even have a reward signal, but you want to learn how to model something, and you also have the capability to take actions.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, especially because a lot of things become somewhat easier, and also like you're allowed, when you're doing something like reinforcement learning, you're allowed to say what happens when you do interventions, which usually in just when you have data and when you have distributions, you're not. Like you can extract more information than what's available just at the distributions by the fact that you can intervene. And also you can leverage, like this is what people do in intrinsic RL, but this is also what people do in Bayesian optimization. You can do things like active learning, for example, which is basically you pick exactly what actions to take that maximize the amount of information you gain from that action. Yeah, and unsupervised learning plays quite a big role in here, because you might get away with doing things with much little data if you know very well the environment.
What are some like practical uses of generative models, and are there any? Well, you don't have to answer that in general, but are there any that you're practically excited about or interested in?
I have one or two ideas that I'm exploring, like from a researchy side. I don't know if any of them are going to pan out. I will tell you by a clear time, hopefully.
Okay.
But I'm very happy to see things like the R community and yeah, like creative applications of GANs and things like this. That's very nice to see. And I'm sure that it's just going to explode as time goes by.
Okay. Do you have an opinion on model-based reinforcement learning?
Yeah, I love it. I think, again, I'm not sure if maybe the fact that we haven't seen so much model-based RL right now is because the models don't work very well. Models in this case being like, I don't know, either GANs or VAEs or whatever you have.
I got working on cartpole.
Sorry? Yeah, of course. Or just because having models in pixel level is just a dumb idea. I don't know. It's interesting to see which one of those or some combination of the two or something that along those lines happens. But I'm very excited. I think it's definitely like a really important direction to go, because it's a lot of what we do is model based as humans. Like we constantly consider what's going to happen when we do something. Like, oh, if I do this, this is going to happen. If I do this, this is going to happen. Oh, if I do this, maybe this will happen. That kind of stuff makes a lot of sense to think about.
One thing that's interesting with GANs is, at least in the original paper, it emphasizes the connection to game theory and the idea that you have like these competing agents, and then they have this equilibrium where they're competing against each other. Do you think there's like going to be more work that looks at different kinds of neural nets that exploit connections to game theory? Because I don't think I've seen too much of that. In fact,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't think so, but I don't know. I mainly don't think so just because I haven't seen much of it.
Yeah.
And because I'm not aware of things where I think, oh, this could be interesting to approach from a game theory point of view. But again, I'm not a game theory expert, so I can't really say. Maybe there's something in there that I have no idea about.
Right.
But it's very interesting. Like I'd be really happy to read a good paper on this topic.
I see.
Yeah.
For a somewhat different question, do you, if you thought about like what kind of algorithm the brain could be doing for credit assignment.
Yeah.
Do you think it's something similar to backpropagation or some kind of backpropagation variant? Or do you have an opinion on that?
So I think I have roughly the same opinion as you, but I don't know. So it makes sense for a lot of things. Backprop is just like, it doesn't make sense from a biological point of view, especially in the sense that if you consider an RNN, like the human brain doesn't wait until the end of the episode to calculate the feedback that it needs to get, and it certainly doesn't store the hidden activations, like the internal state of the entire brain.
Another interesting thing is, if you imagine what it would be like to experience backpropagation through time, you'd experience these hidden states going backwards in time, and in a lot of cases, just modeling what something would look like going backwards in time is kind of tricky. I don't think it's the thing that people really experience. But I talked to Yashua about this today, and he said that there are some studies with rats where they do these mazes and they record place cells, and you can sometimes see the place cell neurons firing in the reverse order of what they go through when they're just thinking about the maze and they're out of it. So
I think a lot of these experiments were actually done by the group of Matt Botvinnik at Princeton and related people. Matt Botvinnik is now leading the neuroscience group at DeepMind. And a lot of these things are actually like not used to justify, but are very related to things like experience replay. But usually, at least from what I remember from my neurobiology classes or something, is that the way these things behave is that the same experience is usually played forward in time, not backward, in that sense. Like, it's kind of more similar, at least in the picture that I have in mind, to experience replay, for example, where you kind of store an approximate version of what happened, and then you run it forward and like with different scenarios or things like this. But it doesn't seem like the same operation is going back in backwards.
Right. Interesting.
I don't know. I think it's definitely like, Joshua, I remember I think the first week I was there, he told us that he has this prior on things that are biological, that the thing that it made sense sometimes to like choose things to do research on or to think about when the brain is doing that. He was talking about like unitary RNNs and why like he liked the idea, but he was skeptical that the brain definitely didn't seem to be doing anything like that. Like with, I don't know, all these crazy complex transformations in there. Backprop is definitely something that should probably be improved from a biologically plausible perspective. Again, I'm talking like, I don't know too much about it, but
it's kind of interesting. So mostly Ben Cellier at our lab at Montreal has proved some connections with this equilibrium propagation method and backpropagation. And for a single point in time, it seems like maybe it could be kind of biologically plausible or moving in that direction, but I don't think it tells you anything about doing something like backpropagation through time.
That's quite interesting, especially because
it involves like the Actually, I don't know what relaxation means in this context, but it would involve something like minimizing this energy value in this graph that runs over many points in time. So like, I think from a computational perspective and biological plausibility, it's probably even worse than backprop.
Worse.
Because you'd actually have to be computing like all of the steps.
Well, you have to compute all of the steps, but the relaxation that they apply basically.
But the cost of every step is like constant. Whereas I think with this type of method, if you did it in time in the naive way, I think the cost for every step would be proportional to the number of steps.
I see.
But
But yeah, it definitely seems like backprop is something that could be improved, like from a biological point of view, and that might lead to better algorithms. And if you have a better algorithm than backprop, like that'd be huge.
Yeah. So this is the last question that I wrote down.
Sure.
But what do you think is going to happen to machine learning research as a profession? More specifically, do you think it's going to continue to be a good profession in industry? Like, could it survive as kind of this stable professional career path like law or medicine? Or another path it could potentially take is it could become more like a specialization of software engineering. So I'm not sure like what the future of the profession is, but do you have any opinion on that?
I don't know, man. I'm a first-year PhD student. I barely know what happened in the last year. I don't know. I could see that there's a lot of more engineering things that we need, like developing better tools and developing better frameworks and
Yeah.
I can also see how it's gonna it's gonna be a massive boom of people being recruited to apply these things in different levels of industry because
It's useful.
problems. Yeah, it's super useful. Like basically, I don't know what's gonna happen as a research community. It may be that like the need of like the money versus pure research on this.
There'll be more of a clear separation than what you see today.
Yeah, maybe the boom is only going to happen in the application side, and maybe there's going to be a saturation on the like pure research side type of things. I honestly don't know. It's very hard to say. Yeah. But I hope I have a job in 5 years.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So those are all the questions I wrote down. Okay. Is there anything that you have like just on the top of your head or something?
No, I don't think so. Who are you interviewing next?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have any concrete plans.
Okay.
Anyone who I should interview?
I don't know.
I don't know.
There's a lot of people in the lab. It's like 200 people by now, no?
Oh no, it's not that big.
Okay. Okay. I remember it was like 100 last year or something. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well,
it was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Bye.
For everything. Ciao, ciao.